also the 22nd Sunday in Ordinary Time, as we call it. And this year, during Ordinary Time, we are reading from the Gospel of St. Luke. Almost continuously, week after week, we read from St. Luke's Gospel. And now we find ourselves in that long part of Luke, where our Lord is making his way towards Jerusalem. And as he goes along his way, he is of course accompanied by his apostles and disciples, and by the people who come to see him. And so as he makes his way to Jerusalem, he is teaching the people. He's forming his disciples. And because you and I come to Mass each Sunday, we are also being formed by Christ, by hearing his word. We are being formed into his disciples. What is the lesson that our Lord wants to teach us in today's Gospel passage, which we have just read? I think maybe there are two lessons. There's something about a lesson concerning humility, and there's also a lesson concerning charity. So to look first at humility. You heard the Gospel parable where our Lord suggests we shouldn't seek out the places of honor, but we should be humble in our comportment. And humility was traditionally defined as the virtue of children and of angels. I'm not sure if that's a very helpful definition. But what do we think of when we think of humility? Firstly, we mustn't think of humility as something which humiliates us. The virtue of humility does not mean abasing ourselves to the ground. The virtue of humility, I think, means understanding our real position in relation to God, who is our Creator. And our humility comes from understanding that God has created us. We are his creatures, and we are subject to him. But the fact that God has created us also gives us a great dignity. That is why humility does not mean abasing ourselves. Does not mean falling on the dust. God has created us with this great human dignity. But he has created us nonetheless to be his creatures and to give worship to him. So that's what humility is for us. It's realizing who we are. Acknowledging the reality of our existence as creatures, subject to God, but endowed by him with dignity. And so the person who is humble understands his own relationship first with God, and then with others. Our first act of humility is to be humble before our God. You and I are not gods. We are creatures. And we owe to God the debt for having created us. We owe to God worship. We owe to him our obedience. But we are also conscious of our dignity as created by him and created for a supernatural end. And so we realize we must never abase ourselves before anyone else. For we are all creatures, and we all share an equal dignity. So if we are humble before God, it makes us realize how also we are to be humble towards each other. That is to say, by appreciating that the other person too has his dignity or her dignity. We are never to be slaves of each other. We are only to be servants of God. And in serving him, we discover that we are all brothers and sisters. Some years ago, when he was preaching about the feast of Corpus Christi, Pope Benedict made a beautiful remark. He said, when we kneel before the Blessed Sacrament on the altar, we realize that we must never kneel before any other authority. This virtue of humility teaches us not only to be humble before God, but to have a correct relationship with our brothers and sisters too. Not to turn them into gods. and not to turn them into animals. We must respect each other because we are all creatures of the one God. And so we must avoid, what they call the big man syndrome. We must avoid kowtowing to those who take on the airs of greatness, for we must only bow before God. And before each other, being humble means recognizing also the image of God in our brothers and sisters, and treating them with the respect which is their due. So this is the great and beautiful virtue of humility which the Lord teaches us in today's Gospel passage. Don't seek out glory. Don't seek out the places of honor. You are all equals. That is what our Lord is saying. You are equal in God's sight and equally loved by Him. I think it is when we all gather and worship God together that we realize our profound equality. If only we would turn and bow before God more frequently, we would never wish to force people to bow before us. This is what humility means for the Christian. Having the right sense of his place in the world, first in relation to God, and then in relation to others. The second lesson I said that we learn from today's Gospel passage is the lesson of charity. Because in the second part of that Gospel passage, our Lord goes on to say, when you host a meal, do not invite your friends or important people, but invite the poor, the lame, the blind, people who cannot pay you back, and people whose human dignity we also must recognize. So our Lord is giving us this principle of charity in the way we deal with others. And I think you have in your patroness, your parish patroness, St. Elizabeth of Hungary, a great model of charity. You know that St. Elizabeth of Hungary was a queen, but she did not sit on her throne. Rather, she opened hospitals. She acted as a nurse. She committed her life to serving others as a Franciscan Third Order member. So she is a living example both of humility and of charity. She, even though she was the Queen of Hungary, she sought out the poor and the blind and the lame. She gave them food, she gave them shelter. And so I think that this parish of St. Elizabeth of Hungary should also be a place that welcomes the disadvantaged, that welcomes the poor, that tries to serve them, that tries to recognize their human dignity, that they are fellow creatures of God, and we must respect all, whoever they are. The first reading too has this beautiful sense also. It comes from the book of Sirach, which is the latest of the wisdom books of the Old Testament. And it starts off with that wonderful first line which we heard. My son, perform your tasks in meekness. It calls us to be meek in the way we perform our tasks. Other translations say in the way you do your business. So this tradition of wisdom in Israel, our Lord took that tradition and He perfected it in the Gospel. But it is a beautiful injunction to us. My son, my daughter, perform your tasks in meekness. That is a call for the Christian too. And this meekness also is a part of the virtue of humility. If we are humble, if we recognize our own dignity before the Lord and the dignity of our brothers and sisters, then we will be meek in the way we treat them. We will not try to overpower others. We will not try to dominate others, which is so much part, alas, of our world. But we will be meek in the way we behave, respectful towards others, seeing them as equals. And this too is a part of the great virtue of humility. So I think, my dear friends, on this 22nd Sunday, And on this first anniversary of your parish, I think these are very appropriate readings because they call to mind very much the virtues of St. Elizabeth of Hungary. And they call to mind also, I think, the virtues which should guide your life as a parish, guide your life as a family united around the altar in this parish, and taking St. Elizabeth as a kind of an exemplar. That this is a place where we should know our relationship with God and with each other in true humility. And this is a place too where we should make charity vibrant, where we should follow the example not only of our Lord, of course, but of our patroness, St. Elizabeth, who too was a beacon of charity in her time and her age. We know that we live in a Christian culture, my dear friends, when the weak are also considered. We know we are not living in a Christian culture when the strong impose themselves on the weak, and the weak have no defense. That is not a Christian culture. That is the culture of the wolf. In a Christian culture, the strong must bear with the weak, as St. Paul said. You who are strong ought to bear with the weak and not to please yourself. We know we are in a Christian culture, my dear friends, when precisely it is, as our Lord says in the Gospel, the poor, the weak and the lame who are considered, when they have a place, when they are protected, when the strong do not insist upon their own strength, but help the weak also. And that must be the sort of parishes we create. Not places where the strong dominate and impose themselves, which is so much the temptation of our world, but a place in which also, as our Lord says in the Gospel, the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, it is those two who must be invited. It is those two who must be welcomed. So, my dear friends, I congratulate you once again on this milestone in your parish life. You are at the very beginning, for the first year, set out on this course, which is inspired by your patroness. A course which will bring you to be a place of humble worship of God, of humble respect for each other, and of charity for all who are in need.